Classic Rock Fans, for another episode of 10 of the Best, and today we're looking at the 10 best heavy metal albums. Of course, these are my own personal preferences and personal choices, and I'd be interested in what yours are. Please leave your list in the comments below. If you like my musings on music, please take a moment to click like and subscribe. And for other ways of supporting this channel and for extra content, do check out my Patreon. Number 10 is Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses from 1987. I remember when I first heard this album as it came out and being struck by those very stabbing guitar notes for the opening track. It seemed to speak of the apocalyptic terror that was to come. It creates an atmosphere of palpable dread, with Axl Rose mumbling "Oh my God" under his breath. Had me reaching for my anti-anxiety meds straight away. Of course, there were a lot of bands who graduated from that Sunset Strip scene in the 1980s, bands like Faster Pussycat and LA Guns, but none of them, I think, harnessed the power and panache that this band had. And that album, Appetite for Destruction, had a huge impact, and certainly ruffled a few feathers, of course, with its controversial Rape sleeve. But it provides an intriguing and grainy snapshot that is the nightly feeding frenzy of the LA lifestyle. This is an album that spawns that now iconic riff of Sweet Child of Mine, the ringtone of choice for a generation, it seems. But for me, the songs that really stand out are the ones that communicate a sense of dissatisfaction and weariness, songs like It's So Easy. And let's not forget, of course, this album has the anthemic and triumphant sounding Paradise City. It's certainly one of those 1980s albums you've just got to own. Number 9 is British Steel by Judas Priest from 1980. You listen to this album, a lot of it sounds quite dated, a bit hackneyed, but you've got to remember this is one of those records that lays down or puts down those blueprints of what was to come later. You know, you get tracks like Living After Midnight and United, that very anthemic, radio-friendly fare, but those songs do not do this album justice, I think. For example, you know, I think Breaking the Law is a real statement of intent on this one, with its guitars and siren communicating a sense of civil as well as sonic unease. Rapid Fire does exactly what it's supposed to do. It's a punishing number. Many see it as well as Deep Purple Speaking 10 years prior to this one as being one of those that provides the foundations for what would become speed metal. And let's not forget tracks like Metal Gods and Grinder, which are all, if not genre defining, certainly genre cementing stuff. All music I've written, if I can refer to my notes. This album kickstarts the heavy metal glory days of the 1980s, and it certainly does. But one of the most prominent things about this record is its iconic artwork, which is now formed, forever fused with the collective unconsciousness. It stares out from thousands of t-shirts, baby grows, coffee mugs and coasters. It's tied in with the core identity of this record. Number 8 is Blizzard of Oz by Ozzy Osbourne from 1980. This album is deceptively complex. I mean, its lyrics are quite deep and philosophical at times, infused with that typical Ozzy Osbourne dry wit. Also, credit has to go to the beautiful guitar work of the late Randy Rhoads on this one. I love that very dampened, thundering start to I Don't Know, which is a great track to open any album. Of course, it's an album that allows us all to board the crazy train with that incendiary riff. Crazy Train is a great song, with its very doom-laden lyrics speaking of the Cold War period and the threat of impending annihilation, a particular cloud we all lived under in the 1980s. Goodbye to Romance is an excellent one, of course. It's Ozzy Osbourne's kind of goodbye, or reflecting back on his Black Sabbath days. We get D, a beautiful, whimsical acoustic piece by Randy Rhoads, which was a tribute to his mother, before launching into the monster that is Suicide Solution. Mr. Crowley's a fascinating number. Of course, it's an ode to the English occultist who was very influential in terms of influencing the subculture of the 1960s. There's no doubt that this is a wonderful album with enough stylistic nods to Black Sabbath to keep us all interesting, but it's a tour de force of Ozziness in its own right. Number 7 is Creatures of the Night by Kiss from 1982. This album is a real manifesto, a real statement of intent from a band that had been toying with a poppier sound with the Unmasked and Dynasty albums, or Dynasty as they say in the USA. And of course then we get the very misguided concept that was the Elder. Kiss and oboes just do not mix for me, and these albums had this background clatter of a band effectively dismantling itself. Creatures of the Night was and it really put them back on the right road, I think. And of course, you know, shout out has to go to Eric Carr. His drumming on this is fantastic, but his drumming on everything was fantastic. I really feel privileged to have seen the guy play a couple of times in the 80s. I mean, these drums on Creatures of the Night, that opening track, are just spine-chilling. Not to mention that the thunderous boom of the drum sound on I Love It Loud. And we're not talking the Abomination. That was the remix version that made its way on their compilation from 1988, I think, Smashes, Thrashes and Hits. Less said about that one, the better. Also, I think this has the best Kiss cover ever. It has a picture of Ace in image only. I don't think he plays on the album at all. Of course, Kiss for this album employ a lot of session musicians, as they had done from the late 70s onwards, as Ace and Peter found themselves, shall we say, unavailable in more ways than one. But it's interesting, of course, we get the punishing sound on War Machine, which is a fantastic number, co-written by Bryan Adams, believe it or not. And then we get perhaps the best song on this album. I love the song Killer. Killer is one of my favourite Kiss songs of all time. And it's the sort of song we want to hear Gene Simmons singing in his demonic persona, not She's So European. Of course, this was the last album where Kiss adorned the iconic makeup. I think by 1983 they'd realised that the makeup seemed very 1970s, very cartoonish, and it was time to move on. Not to mention, of course, if they were going to have any chance of competing with the metallic sheen of newer bands that were announcing themselves, like Metallica, Anthrax, and of course in the UK we had Iron Maiden. They had to fundamentally rethink where they were going. And of course then we get the Unmasking, and then we get Lick It Up. Now Lick It Up, in my opinion, is also a very, very fine album. Number 6 is Metallica by Metallica from 1991. I used to buy lots of heavy metal magazines back in the day, magazines like Metal Hammer and the onomatopoeic Kerrang. I don't even know if these magazines still exist or not. Of course, Kerrang, of course, rises with the new wave of British heavy metal, that very testosterone-fueled movement that seemed like an antidote to the whooshes and beeps of the new wave of electronica that was mapping out a very minimalistic topography at the time. Then, of course, this new band Metallica announces itself. I remember seeing a picture of them in the aforementioned Kerrang magazine, of them abusing Chinese food. And no disrespect to wonderful, wonderful albums like Master of Puppets, Ride the Lightning, Justice for All. These are great, great records, but I have to fess up to loving a melody, an element of melody to my metal. I don't know if you consider that to be oxymoronic or not. So as you can imagine, the Black Album really struck a chord with me, no pun intended. But then I love Fuel and Refuel as well. These are albums, of course, that had the hardcore Metallica audience railing at this band for selling out, and there's no doubt that these pursue a more commercial sound, but these are albums that I love. So Metallica is my go-to album, rightly or wrongly. And of course it spawns a wonderful track, Enter Sandman, Wherever I May Roam, what else, The Unforgiven, which is a great one, and of course that massive hit for them, Nothing Else Matters. Number 5 is Ace of Spades by Motorhead from 1980. Now, many feel that this band had failed to harness the power of their Overkill album when they released Bomber, but they certainly sought to rectify that with this one. And the album cover, of course, is absolutely fantastic. It has a swagger and renegade quality to it, with Lemmy, Phil Taylor, and of course Fast Eddie Clarke pose as Old West outlaws. And of course this links in with a lot of the songs that have an Old West vibe to them, like Shoot You in the Back, Love Me Like a Reptile, and of course Ace of Spades. The Ace of Spades beautifully employs lots of gambling metaphors, as well as a reference and allusion to the death of Wild Bill Hickok. Love Me Like a Reptile is perhaps my favourite song on this record. Live to Win has almost a kind of a southern rock feel to it, which is quite interesting sonically compared with the other tracks on it. But you know, you get the usual punishing Motorhead fare on this with Jailbait, The Hammer, and We Are the Road Crew, which it certainly cements their reputation as being the worst and the loudest band in the world, and certainly no friends to landscape gardeners. I'd like to give a shout out to Fast Eddie Clarke, of course, who I think is a much underrated guitar player. A lot of his guitar lines beautifully complement the lyrics and the music of the song. It doesn't descend into mindless shredding. We get a bit of that, of course, with the ending of We Are the Road Crew. But thematically it links into the chaos and mayhem of this lifestyle that the song depicts. Number 4 is Back in Black by ACDC from 1980. Now ACDC have gone on record as insisting that they're not a heavy metal band, and they're quite right. Their music draws from the paradigms of blues and blues riffs in many respects. But then even Motorhead have argued that they're not heavy metal. They're just the natural progression, the airs of that attitude and volume of rock and roll's original inception. There's no doubt that this album had to be good, considering it's coming hard upon the tragic demise of the original singer, Bon Scott. But they draft in former Geordie singer, of course, Brian Johnson, to give this record that something special, and that he certainly does. He has, in the words of Rolling Stone magazine, he brings to it a tubercular rasp and a chest-beating machismo reminiscent of Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin. He certainly announces himself on this record, but then he had to be heard above the powerhouse dual guitars of the Young Brothers. But despite that, his voice still manages to be to contain some beautiful phrasing and nuances. We get You Shook Me All Night Long, which is surprisingly commercial, to the wonderfully anthemic Rock and Roll and Noise Pollution. Of course, other wonderful tracks on this album, Hell's Bells, with that very sombre ringing of a bell, almost like a tribute to Bon Scott in itself, before you get this new band, this new incarnation of this band announcing themselves with the wonderful title track. Other tracks that have been hailed as fairly misogynistic and gloriously so are tracks like What Do You Do for Money, Honey, and Let Me Put My Love Into You, Babe. Songs that probably have Jermaine Greer frothing at the gills, of course. But let's and also Shake a Leg, of course. Some critics have argued that Shake a Leg sounds suspiciously like Led Zeppelin's Living Loving Maid. When we talk about this album, we have to think about the album cover. It's stark, respectful and beautiful, and doesn't distract from the music one iota. In many ways, it's a blank canvas on which the band forge a new manifesto for moving forward. Number 3 is In Rock by Deep Purple from 1970. Now, if you look at this album through the lens of contemporary metal, this doesn't seem that heavy at all. But if we go back to 1969, 1970, when this album was recorded and released, this is a seriously heavy slab of vinyl. And of course, it marks a transition for this band who decide they no longer want to be Vanilla Fudge, but instead draw their aesthetic from the sensibilities of British pop, albeit a damn sight heavier. But on this album, of course, we get Ian Gillan wailing away like some purgatorial spirit in Child in Time. One of my favourite track on this album, of course, is Flight of the Rat. And of course, it spawns the single Black Knight, which wasn't included on the album, but was certainly recorded during these sessions, which strikes me as a blatant rip-off of Ricky Nelson's Summertime. The album was recorded at IBC Studios in London, and famously the band kept pushing the levels up as much as possible, which probably contributes to the production values of this record and gives it its very frayed and tortured sound. The songs are darker and heavier than anything Deep Purple had done before, and many commentators argue that this album is up there with Sabbath in terms of being considered proto-metal. In fact, the metal archives argue that Speed King and Flight of the Rat are songs that provide the blueprint for what would become speed metal and doom metal. Of course, Sabbath were also barking up that very same tree. It's interesting if we listen to the band prior to In Rock, of course, and this is now when they finally do away with the bouffant hairstyles and frilly shirts, bringing in episode 6 singer Ian Gillan and bassist Roger Glover. It's for me, it's really is the birth of Deep Purple as we know it, that classic Mark II lineup. Now, I feel very privileged to have seen the Mark II lineup live, and I remember Ian Gillan introducing Speed King as perhaps the slowest, the most depressing number Deep Purple have ever done. What a card, eh? And of course we have to mention that iconic cover with that glorious, wonderful pastiche of parody of Mount Rushmore. Of course it's an album that made number 4 in the UK charts, but it ranks higher in mine. Number 2 is Master of Reality by Black Sabbath from 1971. This album is a sonic tour de force with a sludgier and more doom-laden feel than anything they'd done before. Of course, Tony Iommi said he wanted to explore and experiment with sound textures, so the guitars are down-tuned 3 semitones, and it certainly gives the sound a more depth, I think. Of course, this is the album that contains the Weed anthem Sweet Leaf, and you get that wonderful sinister crawl of Children of the Grave. It's a really, really dark album. There's no doubt that this album can be credited with spawning so many subgenres of metal, from doom metal to stoner metal. Of course, I've already mentioned Sweet Leaf, that drug song in many respects, much more so than Fairies Wear Boots. It gives you the munchies just listening to it. And Children of the Grave has a glorious sort of galloping quality to it, a technique that would be employed by Iron Maiden much later on. Overall, the atmosphere evoked on this album is immersive, introspective gloom that positively pulsates with a sense of existential terror. Gone are the usual fantasy forays like Iron Man and Planet Caravan. Instead, we're just forced to focus on the sense of impending doom on this one. The anger of war pigs is traded in for a sense of doomed resignation, epitomised by Ozzy's very nuanced vocals and Iommi's malevolent riffs. And that's not to downplay the contribution by Geezer Butler, who's a brilliant songwriter, fantastic bass player, and a fabulous work ethic if you ever see Black Sabbath live. And I love the drum sound of Bill Ward. Some of you might actually point out, of course, that in my Black Sabbath Worst to Best, a great video if you haven't already checked it out, that I actually ranked the Paranoid album higher than this one. But I do. Paranoid is my favourite Black Sabbath album. In the paradigms of metal, or the most influential metal albums, I think Master of Reality picks it. And number one is Peace of Mind by Iron Maiden from 1983. Iron Maiden are a metal band that combine conceptual intelligence with complex themes, often drawing on literature and mythology. But then, their biggest influences are the progressive rock bands of the 1970s, like Genesis, Yes, and Jethro Tull, and their music certainly reflects that. Of course, this isn't their first album to draw on literature and mythology, but for me, it stepped up with this one. As I said, they draw upon a lot of the elements of progressive rock music from the 70s without the obfuscation and noodly bits that can be dismissed as artistic hubris. Instead, we get a very economical use of musical passages and interesting use of time signatures as well. On this album, of course, we get Revelations, a wonderful track that was pulled out for their last tour. That's a beautiful, melodic and excellent bridge section. And I love the use of metaphorical instrumentation with the troop of that galloping rhythm, which is very much reminiscent of the poetic meter used by Tennyson in that famous poem about the Battle of Balaclava. And Flight of Icarus, of course, which is dark and dramatic, drawing upon mythology, of course. The wonderful guitar solos in there that stick closely with the overall melody of the song, rather than descending into mindless shredding, as I've said before. Of course, the song relates the tale of that tragic overreacher that flies way too close to the sun for his own good. And of course, Where Eagles Dare is another great one, drawn from the paradigms of popular culture. The film, of course, came out in 1968, starring Clint Eastwood and Richard Burton. For me, this is an album that pulls together all those really fascinating, interesting threads of the not only Maiden sound, but identity, with its interesting pun for an album title to its grand literary mythological themes. This album is a stepping stone to the clear brilliance that was to come with Power Slave and, of course, Seventh Son. So there you have it, my 10 favourite heavy metal albums. You've been watching an episode of 10 of the Best. Please click like, subscribe, share this video, check out the Facebook page, but more importantly, please do keep listening.